Margaret and James Whitmore had spent 50 years together in what seemed like a picture-perfect marriage. Their love story was one that inspired everyone in the quiet town of Willow Creek, Massachusetts. From high school sweethearts to doting grandparents, they had built a life full of love, laughter, and unwavering devotion. On a crisp autumn evening, their children and grandchildren gathered in their colonial-style home to celebrate their golden anniversary. The house buzzed with laughter, the warm glow of the chandelier illuminating decades of memories captured in framed photographs lining the walls. As James raised his glass for a toast, his voice was thick with emotion. "To my beautiful Margaret, the love of my life. 50 years ago, I made the best decision of my life by marrying you. I promise to love you for whatever time we have left." Margaret smiled, squeezing his hand, unaware that her world was about to unravel. Later that night, as the last of the guests left and the house fell into silence, James clutched his chest, his face twisting in pain. Margaret gasped, rushing to his side. "James, stay with me," she cried, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. The ambulance arrived quickly, sirens slicing through the peaceful night. As paramedics lifted James onto a stretcher, his grip tightened around Margaret's hand. His lips parted, but the words never came. As the doors closed, Margaret's heart pounded. She had never seen him look so vulnerable. She whispered a silent prayer, unaware that the moment James regained consciousness, the truth he had hidden for 5 decades would come crashing down, changing everything she had ever known. Margaret sat in the hospital waiting room, her hands clenched together as if in prayer. The rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall only heightened her anxiety. James had been taken into surgery, and the doctors assured her they were doing everything they could. But she knew, deep down, this was different. Their children, Daniel and Lisa, arrived soon after, both breathless from rushing to the hospital. "Mom, how is he?" Lisa asked, her voice shaky. Margaret forced a reassuring smile. "He's strong. He'll pull through." But doubt gnawed at her. Hours passed, stretching endlessly, until finally, a doctor approached them. "Mrs. Whitmore?" She shot up from her seat. "Yes. How is he?" "James had a mild heart attack," the doctor said. "We were able to stabilize him, but given his age and medical history, we need to keep him under observation. You can see him now, but only for a few minutes." Relief flooded Margaret, but it was short-lived. She walked into the dimly lit hospital room, her husband lying pale and weak against the sterile white sheets. His eyes flickered open as she sat beside him, taking his frail hand in hers. "Margaret," he whispered. "I'm here, love," she said softly. "You scared me half to death." James let out a shaky breath. "There's something I need to tell you." "Shoo, rest now. We can talk when you're stronger," she said, brushing his graying hair back. But James shook his head weakly. "No, I need to tell you now, before it's too late." Margaret felt a cold sense of dread settle in her stomach. "James, what is it?" His fingers trembled as he clutched her hand. "I've been keeping a secret for 50 years, and I don't know if you'll ever forgive me." Margaret's heart stopped. She had loved this man for half a century, shared everything with him. What could possibly be so terrible? James exhaled, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm not the man you think I am." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. "James, what are you talking about?" Before he could respond, a sudden beeping noise filled the room, the machines blaring as nurses and doctors rushed in. James's eyes rolled back, his grip on Margaret loosening. "James," she cried as they pushed her back. She watched in horror as her husband of 50 years slipped into unconsciousness, his confession hanging in the air like an unfinished sentence. And just like that, her world shattered. Margaret sat frozen outside the ICU, her mind replaying James's last words over and over. "I'm not the man you think I am." What had he meant? Was he delirious from the medication? Or had he been carrying a secret for their entire marriage? Lisa and Daniel sat beside her, but she barely registered their voices. Hours passed and finally, a nurse approached. "Mrs. Whitmore? Your husband is stable, but he's unconscious. We're monitoring him closely." Margaret nodded numbly, her hands gripping the armrests of the chair. "Can I see him?" "Not yet. We'll let you know when he wakes up." She gave a hollow thanks and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. James had always been a good man, kind, loving, devoted. What kind of secret could shake that foundation? Lisa touched her arm gently. Mom, what did Dad say to you? Margaret hesitated. He said he's not the man I think he is. Daniel frowned. What does that even mean? I don't know. Margaret rubbed her temples. But I need to find out. Later that evening, unable to sit still, she went home to gather a few things for James. As she walked into their bedroom, the weight of the years they had spent together pressed down on her. The framed wedding photo on the nightstand, their first anniversary gift, the old wooden dresser he had built with his own hands. Everything screamed of a love that had lasted a lifetime. But was it all a lie? She opened James's dresser, pulling out a fresh pair of pajamas. As she did, her fingers brushed against something hard. A small, locked wooden box at the back of the drawer. Margaret's heartbeat quickened. James never kept secrets from her. At least, that's what she had always believed. With trembling hands, she pulled the box out and sat on the bed, staring at it. Where was the key? She thought for a moment before checking the top drawer of his nightstand. And there it was. She hesitated. Should I do this? Then she remembered James's words in the hospital, the fear in his eyes. She slid the key into the lock and turned it. Inside, there were a few folded documents, some old letters, and, strangest of all, a faded black and white photograph of a young woman holding a baby. Margaret frowned. The woman in the photo was not her. And the baby, it was not one of their children. A chill ran down her spine. Who were they? And why had James kept this hidden from her for 50 years? Margaret's hands trembled as she held the old photograph. The woman had soft curls framing her delicate face, and the baby in her arms looked no older than a few months. There was something unsettling about the image. Not because it was unfamiliar, but because James had kept it hidden all these years. Her breath came in short gasps as she turned the photo over. There, in faded ink, was a handwritten note. Eleanor and James Jr. 1954. Margaret's stomach lurched. James Jr.? She clutched the photograph as she dug through the other papers in the box. There were old letters neatly folded, their edges yellowed with time. She opened one and began to read. My dearest James, I don't know how much longer I can do this. Every time I see our baby's face, I wonder how you can bear to be away from him. You promised you'd come back for us, but it's been 2 years. Do you still love me? Do you still love your son? Please, James, we need you. I need you. Yours always, Eleanor. Margaret's vision blurred as she stared at the words. This can't be real. Her husband, the man she had spent 5 decades loving, raising children with, growing old beside, had another family? Another child? She felt the room spin as she reached for another letter, dated a year later. James, I've accepted that you're never coming back. Our son asks about you every day, and I don't know what to tell him anymore. You said we'd build a life together, but I was just a secret you wanted to forget. I won't beg anymore. I'm done. Goodbye. Eleanor. Margaret dropped the letter onto the bed, her breath shallow. She had lived a lie for 50 years. James had been married before. He had abandoned a woman and a child, his own flesh and blood, and he had never told her. Her hands clenched into fists. Was he ever planning to confess? Or had his heart attack forced him to face the truth he had buried for so long? Tears welled in her eyes, but she wiped them away. This wasn't over. She needed answers. Margaret grabbed the letters, the photograph, and the box. Then, with newfound determination, she marched out of the house. She was going back to the hospital. James Whitmore had some explaining to do. The hospital room was dimly lit, the steady beep of the heart monitor the only sound breaking the silence. James lay still, his face pale against the crisp white sheets. His breathing was slow, steady. Margaret stood at the doorway, her fingers gripping the old letters and the photograph. Her heart pounded in her chest, anger and betrayal twisting inside her like a storm. She had loved this man for 50 years. She had given him everything, her youth, her devotion, her trust. And all this time he had hidden an unforgivable secret. She stepped forward, placing the photograph on the small bedside table with a soft thud. The sound made James stir. His eyelids fluttered open and he blinked up at her, his gaze hazy with confusion. Margaret. His voice was weak, barely above a whisper. She didn't answer. She simply picked up the photograph and held it in front of him. "Who is she, James?" she asked, her voice calm but edged with ice. James's face paled even more. His tired eyes darted to the picture, and for a long moment he said nothing. But Margaret saw it, the flicker of recognition, the guilt, the pain. "Margaret, please don't." Her voice trembled, but she wouldn't let herself cry. "Not yet. Tell me the truth. Tell me about Eleanor. Tell me about James Jr." James squeezed his eyes shut, a deep sigh escaping his lips. "I was hoping you'd never find out," he murmured. Margaret's nails dug into her palms. "Well, I did. And now I need to know everything." James swallowed hard, his throat working as if the words physically pained him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "It was before I met you," he said, his voice hoarse. "I was young. Foolish. I met Eleanor when I was stationed in North Carolina. We were just kids, and before we knew it, she was pregnant. I promised her I'd take care of her, that we'd get married and raise our son together." Margaret's breath hitched. "And?" James's face twisted with shame. "And I left." She sucked in a sharp breath, nausea churning in her stomach. "You abandoned them?" James nodded slowly, unable to meet her eyes. "I got cold feet. I wasn't ready to be a husband, a father. My parents told me to focus on my future, that I was too young to ruin my life with responsibility. So, I listened to them. I left Eleanor and the baby behind. I promised I'd come back, but I never did." Margaret's hands trembled as she clutched the letters. "She wrote to you, James. She begged you to come back. And you ignored her." Tears pooled in James's eyes. "I regretted it every single day. But by the time I was ready to face what I'd done, it was too late. Eleanor was gone. She moved away. I had no way to find her." Margaret shook her head in disbelief. "So you just started over? Married me? Built a life with me like none of this ever happened?" James let out a shuddering breath. "I never wanted to lie to you, Margaret. But I was ashamed. I didn't know how to tell you. And the longer I kept it buried, the harder it was to confess." Margaret clenched her jaw. "Did you ever try to find your son?" James looked away, guilt heavy in his features. "No," he admitted. "I was a coward." Silence filled the room. Margaret felt something inside her break. The man she had loved, the man she had trusted with her heart, had lived a life for 50 years. And now, on what could be his deathbed, she was finally seeing him for who he really was. A stranger. She took a shaky breath and stepped back. "I need some air." James reached out weakly. "Margaret, please," but she was already walking away, the letters clutched tightly in her hands. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew one thing for certain. She had to find James Jr. And she had to tell him the truth his father never did. Margaret sat in her car outside the hospital, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the weight of James's confession was pressing down on her chest. He abandoned them. She had lived 5 decades believing she knew the man she had married, only to find out he had been a coward. A liar. A man who had left his own child behind. Tears burned at the back of her eyes, but she refused to cry. Not yet. Instead, she reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, and opened a search engine. James Whitmore Jr. She had no idea what she would find. The letters from Eleanor had no return address, no clues as to where she had gone. But Margaret wasn't the kind of woman to give up easily. She scrolled through results, countless names, but none that seemed to fit. Then she tried another approach. Eleanor Whitmore, North Carolina. Nothing. Her heart pounded as she tried one last search. James Whitmore Jr., son of Eleanor, born 1954. This time something caught her eye. An obituary. Her stomach twisted as she clicked the link. It was an old newspaper clipping from 1998. James Whitmore Jr., 44, passed away unexpectedly in his home in Raleigh, North Carolina. He is survived by his wife, Catherine Whitmore, and his 2 children, David and Emily Whitmore. Margaret covered her mouth with her hand. He was gone. James's son, the boy he had left behind, had died years ago. And James never even knew. A sharp pain stabbed through her chest, anger and sorrow mixing into something unbearable. But then she read the next part. A dedicated husband and father, James spent his life working as a history professor and was known for his passion for teaching. He is remembered by his wife, children, and friends as a man of deep integrity and kindness. Margaret's throat tightened. Despite being abandoned by his father, James Jr. had grown into a good man. He had built a life, a family, something beautiful. And now his own children, James's grandchildren, were out there somewhere. Margaret swallowed hard. They had a right to know the truth. She took a deep breath and searched for David and Emily Whitmore. A few minutes later, she found a promising lead. Dr. David Whitmore, 42, neurosurgeon at Duke University Medical Center. She stared at the screen. He was real. James's grandson was real. Margaret's hands shook as she clicked on his hospital profile. There was an office number listed. For a long moment, she hesitated. What if he didn't want to know? What if this ruined everything? Then she thought about James in that hospital bed, the way he had begged for forgiveness too late. She refused to let this end the same way. With a deep breath, Margaret dialed the number. It was time for the truth to come out. Margaret's heart pounded as the phone rang. Each tone felt like an eternity. Duke Neurosurgery, Dr. Whitmore's office. How can I help you? A woman's voice, calm, professional. Margaret hesitated for a moment before speaking. Hello, my name is Margaret Whitmore. I need to speak with Dr. David Whitmore. It's urgent. Family related. There was a pause. Are you a patient? No, she swallowed. It's about his grandfather. It's important. The receptionist hesitated. Dr. Whitmore is in surgery at the moment. I can take a message. Margaret exhaled. Please, just tell him it's about James Whitmore, his grandfather. He may not recognize the name, but please, ask him to call me back. She gave her number, her voice shaking. All right, ma'am. I'll pass it along. The call ended. Margaret sat in silence, gripping her phone as she stared out of the windshield. What if he never called back? What if she had just shattered a life that didn't need breaking? But she knew one thing for sure. He deserved to know. Hours passed. Margaret sat by James's bedside in the hospital, watching him sleep. His breathing was uneven, his body frail. The strong, confident man she had known all her life looked like a ghost of himself. Her phone buzzed. She nearly dropped it as she grabbed it from her lap. Unknown number. Her fingers trembled as she answered. Hello. A deep, cautious voice came through. This is Dr. David Whitmore. I was told you called about my grandfather. Margaret took a breath. Yes, thank you for calling back. There was a long pause. I think you may have the wrong person. My grandfather passed away decades ago. Margaret's throat tightened. David, I don't think he did. Silence. Then, more wary now. Who are you? My name is Margaret Whitmore. I've been married to James Whitmore for 50 years. She swallowed. And I just found out that he's your grandfather. The line was silent. Then David let out a sharp breath. That's impossible. My grandfather abandoned my dad before he was even old enough to remember him. We never knew anything about him. I know. Margaret closed her eyes. I just found out myself. James, my James, he never told me about Eleanor. About your father. He kept it a secret for 50 years. David's voice hardened. So now, after all this time, you're telling me he wants to meet me? To apologize? He gave a short, bitter laugh. I'm sorry, but I don't need to hear an old man's regrets. Margaret's grip on the phone tightened. David, I don't expect you to forgive him. I don't even know if I can. But he's dying. And I think he wants to make things right. Silence again. When David spoke again, his voice was softer. He's dying? Margaret nodded, even though he couldn't see her. He had a heart attack. He's stable, but the doctors don't know how much time he has left. A long exhale, then a pause. Finally, David spoke. I don't know if I want to meet him, but I need to know more. Margaret's heart ached. I understand. I can tell you everything. Another pause. Then, where's he? Margaret's breath caught. Riverside Memorial Hospital. Room 214. A beat of silence. Then, quietly, I'll think about it. The line went dead. Margaret set the phone down, her heart racing. Had she just opened a door that should have stayed closed? Or had she given David a chance to finally know the truth? She could only hope it wasn't too late. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady hum of machines and the soft beeping of James's heart monitor. Margaret sat by his bedside, staring at the frail man she had spent her life with. Would he even have told her if she hadn't found the letters? Would he have taken this secret to his grave? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Margaret turned, her breath catching in her throat. A tall man stood in the doorway, dark-haired, clean-shaven, with sharp eyes that held a guarded wariness. He looked nothing like James, but something about his presence, his quiet intensity, felt familiar. David Whitmore had come. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Margaret stood and gestured toward the chair beside her. "David," she said softly. He hesitated before stepping inside, his movements careful, measured. His eyes flicked toward James, who was still unconscious, and his jaw tightened. "This is him?" he asked, his voice unreadable. Margaret nodded. "Yes." David exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "I don't even know why I came here," he admitted. "I spent my whole life not knowing who he was. And now, when it's almost over, I'm supposed to care." Margaret swallowed. "I don't expect you to. I don't even know if he deserves that." David glanced at her. "And yet, you stayed with him for 50 years. Margaret hesitated, the weight of his words settling over her. "I thought I knew him," she said quietly. "But now, I don't know anymore." David studied her for a moment, then turned his gaze back to James. "Did he ever try to find my father?" he asked. Margaret sighed. "No." David let out a bitter chuckle. "Figures." Silence stretched between them. Then James stirred. His eyelids fluttered open, his breathing uneven. He blinked, confusion crossing his face before his gaze landed on David. For a moment he simply stared. Then his expression shifted, recognition, pain, regret. James swallowed hard. "You're him." David's face remained unreadable. "I'm your grandson. Not that you'd know." James tried to sit up, but his body was weak. His voice shook as he whispered, "I never thought I'd see you." David scoffed. "Yeah, well, that makes two of us." James's eyes filled with something Margaret had never seen before. Genuine sorrow. "I'm sorry," he rasped. "For everything." David crossed his arms. "Sorry for what? For abandoning my father? For never trying to find us? For letting us grow up thinking you were just a ghost?" James flinched. "I was a coward," he admitted. "I was young and selfish, and I made the worst mistake of my life." David shook his head. "And you never tried to fix it." James's voice cracked. "Because I didn't know how." David let out a sharp breath, his fists clenched. "You know what's funny? My father was the best man I ever knew. He was kind, loyal. He spent his whole life wondering what he did wrong to make his father walk away." His voice wavered. "And now I find out it was never about him. It was about you." James closed his eyes, his chest rising and falling with labored breaths. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he whispered. "But I need you to know. I thought about him every day." David's jaw tightened. "That doesn't change anything." Silence filled the room, thick and heavy. Margaret reached out, placing a gentle hand on David's arm. "You don't have to forgive him," she said softly. "But maybe, just maybe, knowing the truth will give you something your father never had." David swallowed hard, his expression conflicted. For the first time in his life, he was standing in front of the man who had shaped his father's pain, the man who had left scars on his family without even knowing them. And now that man was asking for something he wasn't sure he could give. The hospital room felt suffocating, the air thick with decades of unspoken words. David stood at the foot of the bed, staring down at the man who had shaped his father's deepest wound. James looked smaller, weaker, his breathing uneven. Margaret sat quietly beside them, her heart aching for both men. David exhaled sharply. "You don't deserve my forgiveness," he said, his voice steady but cold. "You don't get to just say you're sorry and expect it to fix everything." James closed his eyes for a moment as if the words physically hurt him. "I know," he whispered. "I know I don't deserve it." David crossed his arms. "My father never stopped wondering about you. Even when he had a family of his own, a career, a life, he always felt like something was missing. And now I find out that you were out there, living your life, while he spent his childhood wondering why he wasn't enough for you to stay." James's voice cracked. "He was enough. He was everything. I was the failure, not him." David's jaw clenched. "Then why didn't you ever look for him?" James swallowed hard. "Because I was ashamed. I told myself that if I found him, it would only bring him pain. That he was better off never knowing the kind of man I was." David let out a bitter laugh. "That's convenient." Silence settled between them. Margaret reached out, squeezing James's frail hand. "You should have told me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You should have let me help you carry this." James turned to her, his eyes full of regret. I was afraid you'd leave me. Margaret's breath hitched. Maybe I should have. James's fingers tightened weakly around hers. But you didn't. David shifted uncomfortably. I don't know why I came here, he admitted. Maybe I wanted to see if you were the monster my father imagined you to be. He shook his head. But looking at you now, all I see is a sad, broken old man who ran away from his past and never had the courage to face it. James's eyes filled with tears. That's exactly who I am. Margaret felt her own tears slip down her cheeks. She had spent a lifetime loving this man, believing in his goodness. And yet, here they were, facing the wreckage of the choices he had made. David took a deep breath. I won't forgive you, he said, his voice firm. Not today. Maybe not ever. James nodded, accepting the words like a punishment he knew he deserved. But David hesitated. I won't let my father's story end with bitterness. He was a better man than you, and I want my children to know where they came from. The real story, not just the absence you left behind. James's lips trembled. Tell me about him, he whispered. David's expression softened, just slightly. He was a history professor. He loved old books, the smell of fresh paper. He used to take me and my sister to museums on weekends and tell us stories about ancient kings and lost civilizations. James closed his eyes, listening intently, as if trying to hold onto every word. He never raised his voice, David continued. Even when he was disappointed, he'd just sit quietly and talk to us. He believed in kindness, in honesty, and he never stopped wondering about you. A single tear slipped down James's cheek. I wish I had known him. David nodded. So do I. Silence fell again, but this time it wasn't quite as heavy. David glanced at Margaret. Take care of him, he said quietly. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out the door. Margaret and James sat in silence, the echoes of the past still lingering in the room. James took a shaky breath. I don't deserve anything from him. Margaret squeezed his hand. Maybe not, but you got to hear about him, and that's more than you ever gave him. James closed his eyes, his face etched with sorrow. I just hope I can see him when I go. Margaret swallowed back tears. I hope so too, James. As the machines beeped softly around them, Margaret knew that their time together was running out, and for the first time, she wasn't sure if she would be holding his hand when the end finally came. The days after David's visit passed in a blur. James grew weaker, his body slowly surrendering to time. Margaret stayed by his side, but something between them had shifted. An invisible wall of grief and regret that neither could break. She still loved him. That much she knew. But love didn't erase the pain. It didn't undo the betrayal. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow into the hospital room, James stirred. His breathing was shallow, his skin pale. Margaret leaned in, brushing a trembling hand over his. His eyes fluttered open, hazy but searching. Margaret! His voice was barely above a whisper. I'm here, she said softly. A small, weak smile touched his lips. Thank you for staying. Margaret swallowed back the lump in her throat. I almost didn't. James's eyes darkened with understanding. I know. Pause. Do you regret it? Margaret hesitated. She thought about the years, the laughter, the love, the quiet moments that had made up a lifetime together. But she also thought about the lie, the pain, the truth he had hidden from her for 50 years. I regret that you didn't trust me enough to tell me, she admitted. James exhaled shakily. I regret that too. Silence stretched between them. Then James's fingers curled weakly around hers. I need you to do something for me. Margaret blinked away tears. Anything. His breathing was labored now, his voice barely audible. Tell David that I'm proud of him. His lips trembled. That I'm sorry. I was never there. Margaret nodded, her throat tightening. I will. James's eyes softened. And Margaret. He paused, struggling to find the strength for his final words. I never deserved you. Tears slipped down Margaret's cheeks as she pressed his hand to her lips. I loved you anyway. James let out a breath, a slow, peaceful exhale. His grip loosened, his chest rising and falling one last time before finally it stilled. Margaret closed her eyes, a deep, aching sorrow settling over her. It was over. 50 years of love, of secrets, of heartbreak, all ending in the quiet stillness of a hospital room. She sat there for a long time, holding his hand, saying the goodbyes she never thought she'd have to say. And when she finally rose to leave, she knew one thing for certain. She would keep her promise. The next morning, she dialed David's number. And for the first time in 50 years, the truth was finally set free.